There was definitely a racist housing policy in the United States that pushed for rental and public housing for black families and home ownership for white families. By the 1950s, I don't know how it works here in Washington, but by the 1950s in Pittsburgh, the projects were predominantly black. When they started, they weren't mainly black. When the projects started, there were white people who lived in the projects mainly and some black people. But by the 50s, most of what we call the projects became black in these areas. Or if you're in Texas or somewhere, they became mainly people who spoke Spanish, people from Mexico and other places. Basically, there's two concepts that have governed U.S. federal policy since the 1970s, and those are privatization and austerity. Privatization is, instead of having public housing, starting to move it to the market, to private areas. And austerity is, instead of putting money into funding stuff for low-income people and other people, to start to take that funding away, like the government's too big. And that started in the 70s, and it's probably really, this whole Trump phenomena probably is a culmination of this long trend over many, many years where people organized around privatization and austerity. Basically, they have a narrative that the government's too big and we need to privatize everything with the government. That's a big part of their narrative. Now, one thing about this whole trend towards privatization, austerity, it's not something that happened overnight. It was a large movement. Sometimes they called it the Tea Party movement, or they called it a lot of different things, but it grew over decades and eventually was able to capture not just the White House, but the House and the Senate as well. Many of the projects where people were concentrated, but the mixed income thing never happened. What they did is they gave people Section 8 vouchers and said, go try to find a place where you can live. And in Pittsburgh, the waiting list for Section 8 vouchers is 3 to 5 years long. There's 5,000 families on the waiting list. And even once you get a voucher, they have a lottery system in Pittsburgh. So the 5,000 people are on a lottery. When your number comes up, you get a voucher, and you got to go try to find a place. You have 120 days to find a place. If you don't find a place in 120 days, your voucher goes back, and you got to get back in line. In 2012, in Pittsburgh, $12 million worth of vouchers were turned back to the Pittsburgh Housing Authority because people couldn't find a place. So people are looking and looking, but it's really hard because there's really a lack of housing for low-income and very low-income families. Housing authorities are different, and the Pittsburgh Housing Authority is called a Moving to Work Housing Authority. They name things, like they named us, I'm just talking about names. Moving to work don't have nothing to do with moving or work. They create these names for these programs and they really aren't aware of what they're about. But as a moving to work agency, that $12 million that went back to the Housing Authority didn't have to go back into the pool for Section 8. They could use it wherever they wanted to use it, and they've created a couple development corporations that use it to do their own deals. Washington County probably isn't a moving to work, but many public housing authorities are, and they can take that money and it becomes a slush fund for them.
And people who are struggling in other ways, people who've had bad credit experiences, people who have messed up in their younger days, now they want to get back on track. So we're there for everybody. And again, it is a free program. There's a brochure in your packets on that. So if you're interested, there's only 2 requirements to enroll. One, you're a first-time home buyer, meaning you haven't been on a deed or a mortgage in the past 3 years. You may have had a house 10 years ago, but you've been renting for the past 7, 8 years maybe. The clock resets. You're a first-time home buyer, okay? And then we do have a minimum income requirement of $26,000 or more per year, because people have to have some kind of income to be able to support this, because we don't want to set people up for failure. But we look at your job income, court-ordered child support, Social Security payments, pensions, et cetera, because we piece all that together to meet that minimum as well. So we want to keep that window as wide as possible, keep the opportunities open as wide as possible.
Us a good bit about how we can overcome some of those things as individuals. But I want to put one more thing out to you guys, and that's how we can overcome and tackle some of these barriers as a group, right? And that's how you make these changes on a large scale. It has to be together.